health orders, we ask that you practice social distancing and remain in your seats. In order to keep everyone safe, it's important we all refrain from shaking hands, mingling and singing whilst in the enclosed site. I would also like to welcome all those who are watching this live stream in communities across New South Wales. We will be commencing the official Remembrance Day ceremony in approximately 15 minutes. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce my guest, Trish Skane, who recently published Frontline of the Pandemic, Australia, 1919. Trish is from the City of Canada Bay Historical Society and together with the Royal Australian Historical Society has researched and compiled letters and diaries of frontline workers during the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic in Australia. The flu killed almost 15,000 Australians and tens of millions of people worldwide. Many Australian women joined the Red Cross as voluntary aides. One of these was Jean Kerr-Lewis, who volunteered for work at the Thomas Walker Emergency Hospital in Concord. Jean wrote numerous letters to her family recounting her experience of working at the hospital. Tricia, good morning.
Good morning, Gareth.
Nice to have your company. You must, in the book, get a sense of déjà vu. 2020 is almost a mirror of 1919.
That's exactly what I found. I was amazed at the similarities. All the things that were happening in our society today were happening back then too.
Tell me about the Thomas Walker Hospital and your connection to it and how this whole project started.
Thomas Walker was actually connected to the British and the English and Scottish sides of the royal family, and as a member of the executive of the Concord, or City of Canada Bay Heritage as we are now, I'm also a tour guide at the estate that he acquired in Concord. And there in 2013, the granddaughter of Ethel Turner came to me and said she had all these letters from her Aunt Jean. Would I be interested in transcribing them? So that started the basis for the book. And then we found more letters through Royal Prince Alfred's archives and started looking for other letters from people from that era, and we're amazed at what we found.
Look, the book is a fantastic read, Frontline of the Pandemic.
Thank you.
The letters that you have in the book really do demonstrate a wonderful family bond of the Kerr-Lewis family. I mean, when you're talking of love and tragedy and comedy, can you explore some of that with me?
Well, naturally, Jean was wanting to keep her letters rather light-hearted that she sent to her mother, because her mother was very worried about her working in such a deadly environment with so many patients dying of the flu. But Jean, as I said, loved nursing and wanted to stay there. But she also wrote about the camaraderie between her colleagues and the doctors and the nurses there and what life was like on a day-to-day basis.
I found it fascinating that Thomas Walker himself has a poem dedicated to him by the great Henry Lawson. The poem is called The Unknown Patient. Can you tell us about that?
Henry Lawson was actually at the hospital at one stage when he had a fall from the cliffs at Manly, and wandering around the grounds one day he saw this little sandstone ledge with a scribbled note on it that said, "God bless Thomas Walker." So he wanted to explore who had possibly written it, and it made him think about the different types of patients that were there suffering Christ or a tortured Magdalene. He was imagining all sorts of things, and so he was inspired to write this wonderful poem.
I just pause and I'd like to welcome the Right Honourable the Lord Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore, joining us this morning. Patricia, one of the things you say in the book, you said in 1919, Australia was the place to be during this pandemic. How so?
Because we were an island continent and we were able to implement quite a lot of quarantine at the time, we were able to have a better situation than what was facing the rest of the world at the time, as we are today.
And the other thing I liked reading in the book was a particular letter that you wrote from a survivor. Tell us about that letter and survivors in general.
This particular survivor was talking about what it was like to have the flu, and he said, "I want to tell you all about it," and he went on to describe for quite a few pages what it was like. I had the sense from reading it that he was actually perhaps a reporter or a journalist or someone like that, because he wrote beautiful prose, but also the fact that at times it seemed like he was hallucinating with, the nurses all flitting around and all the things that were happening, and his high temperature was obviously giving him delirium at times.
The section on Chaplain Hill, what was that role?
Chaplain Hill was quite a significant person in the story, more because he arrived a week after a young nurse called Annie Egan had died, and that had caused a lot of controversy in Australia because they would not allow a priest in to hear her confession. So unfortunately he didn't get there till a week later, but he also contracted the Spanish influenza, and he also wrote what it was like to be there as a patient as well as a chaplain. And he had to be all things to all men because he was the only chaplain on site, even though there were so many denominations that needed a minister.
Just to also say that you mentioned Sister Annie Egan, who was, and the whole issue of the churches at the time, that was denied the last rites. But just pause for a moment, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our Premier, the Honourable Gladys Berejiklian, Premier of New South Wales. So, Patricia, the last rites being denied, Sister Annie Walker, it's almost like today.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, again, there are so many patients in the hospitals, and the staff that are not allowed to be there because they don't have the infection, and even their family members are often not allowed to be there when these people are dying. So it's a very tragic situation, and we have mentioned that in the book, that it should come with the warning, because very many of the sections are graphic as to what is happening both then and today.
Yeah, look, again, reading this book, it's almost like reading a commentary on the year 2020 in Australia.
Yes.
It's such a great parallel. But the most significant thing for me was the importance of the Red Cross. Tell us about that.
The Red Cross workers were amazing in the work that they did, because a lot of the nurses who had married and had not been allowed to return to their profession were now coming back into nursing. They would go into the houses, to the tenements, and they would actually triage the patients, because the doctors were just so flat out in trying to handle all the patients they could. So the nurses would go in and decide, does this person need to go to hospital, or can we help them?
Patricia, just like today, with the closure of borders and not being able to go to different states of this great Commonwealth of ours, you talked about the borders being closed then, and you gave a funny example that between Queensland and New South Wales, to bank, you had to put your banking in a cigar box and it was dragged by rope across the border. Tell us about that. It's amazing.
Well, on the Coolangatta side, they had butchers and bakers and banks, and on the other side they didn't. So people had to actually be inventive in how they could either get across the border, which they weren't supposed to do, or, as I said, to find ways to actually get around the problems they had. So this cigar box, taking the bank details from one side of the border to the other, was quite inventive.
The novel inventiveness of the Australian personality is amazing. And also masks. Masks became the order of the day. But you also tell another funny story that one particular husband took his wife's maid to a film, and his excuse, I didn't know it wasn't my wife because of the mask.
I don't think his wife believed that story, though.
All right, Anzac Day 2020, you know, we couldn't be assembled here at the Cenotaph, and in 1919, Anzac Day, tell us how difficult that was.
There were a few places where they did hold a ceremony, such as in the Domain and out at the Randwick Military Hospital, but so many of the other sites they actually closed down because of the situation, and the government promised that they would have commemorations later in the year when it was safer to do so. So in 2020, I remember coming out to my front driveway and looking up and down the street and seeing all the candles and the lights and the neighbours and the children there, and then to hear the last post and reveille echoing through the hills and across the water. It was spine-tingling, really was.
That's a custom that I really hope now continues into 2021, that in each street across New South Wales, people come out and do the same thing.
Yes, it was amazing.
All right, the vaccine, the big vaccine and the story of the vaccine, but there was a conflict between the doctor who I think invented the vaccine or came up with the idea, Dr. Dean, and he was opposed by Dr. Crumston. Tell us about that.
Well, Dr. Dean actually had several hundred patients that he'd injected, and none of them had died. The vaccine seemed to be working. So he sent the information off to the government, but Dr. Crumston was not happy with it, and he sat on that information for 6 weeks and did nothing while people were still dying. And it was actually the Sun newspaper that broke it as an expose and told people the vaccine is here and this is what's going on. And so then Dr. Dean was exonerated.
Patricia, this is a marvellous book and I'd encourage anyone to get hold of it. It's the front line of the pandemic.
Yes.
Patricia Skane and Lois McPhee, but please buy it and you'll enjoy the read. Patricia, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
This
Thank
morning.
you so much for having me today.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the veterans from the Second World War who are attending the service today, as well as all other veterans watching as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Able seaman Frank McGovern, Royal Australian Navy. Frank fought throughout the Pacific and was a prisoner of war for 3.5 years. Infantryman Rhett Chard, Australian Army, fought in New Guinea and the Kokoda Track. Corporal Jack Van Emden, Royal Australian Air Force, an instrument maker working on aircraft around the Pacific. Corporal John McLean, who was a cipher in the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force. Thank you for being here and thank you very much for your service. I know our Governor is on time. She'll be here very, very shortly, so we will come back to that in one moment. Just while we're waiting for the Governor and referring back to that book, on page 162 of the book, this is what's written. At Sydney's Rookwood Cemetery, a lichen-spotted headstone captures a family's double burden of grief. The grave contains the remains of 19-year-old Harriet Ann Otway, who died on the 2nd of July 1919. Its monument also commemorates her brother Henry James Otway, who died of wounds in Belgium, 23rd of September 1917 at the age of 21. While Henry was killed at the infamous Battle of Passchendaele, Harriet's headstone makes no mention of her courageous combat with Spanish flu. It is important, ladies and gentlemen, that we remember those who fought in the war and those who experienced and fought against the Spanish flu. This also should be commemorated. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand for the arrival of Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, Governor of New South Wales.
Sentries, ho! Sentries, General Salute.
The Governor will now
Present
receive the Vice-Regal Salute.
Sentries, ho!
Ladies and gentlemen, the catafalque party from the Royal Australian Navy will now mount the cenotaph. Mount the catafalque.
Sentries, by the centre, slow. Sentries, up. Sentries, outwards, turn. Sentries, rest on arms, reverse.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please be seated? Welcome to the 2020 Remembrance Day ceremony. My name is Gareth McRae and I'm honoured to be your Master of Ceremonies. Today's ceremony is organised by the New South Wales Government with assistance from the Australian Defence Force, the Returned and Services League New South Wales and the City of Sydney. In 1918, the German forces agreed to an armistice, a truce, with the Allied troops, which signalled the end of the First World War. The armistice was met by celebration around the world. People yelled, cheered and danced in the streets, while others reflected with great sadness the extraordinary losses and suffering from many nations. Over 9 million soldiers, including 60,000 Australians and 6 million civilians, were killed. Over 416,000 Australians volunteered for service in World War I. In October 1997, the Governor-General issued a proclamation declaring 11 November as Remembrance Day. As this year, we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Another very special mention of thanks to the veterans of the Second World War who are able to be with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like now to invite Uncle Harry Alley to the lectern for an acknowledgement to country. Uncle Harry will also read a letter from Francis Walter Bertie Firth, one of 3 Aboriginal brothers from Pilliga who fought in the First World War.
We gather today on land that is sacred. We gather to honour our earliest Anzac traditions of the First World War and the years of service that followed, to pay our tribute to the wartime service and sacrifice of those on the battlefront and the unflagging commitment of those at home. For thousands of years, people have gathered in this place to share our stories, to celebrate our culture, to remember our ancestors. These rituals make it a sacred site, a precious inheritance of land and ceremony. Sacred to its first people, the Gadigal, whose ancestors nurtured it through history, sacred as the site of Australia's first Remembrance Day service. As a descendant of the Gudjala people, I will never forget the dignity and opportunity furnished by the Australian Defence Force, and certainly during my time as serving as an airman in the Royal Australian Air Force. As we remember, it is my pleasure to be able to share with you a letter from Francis Walter Bertie Firth, sent to his mother in 1918. Bertie was one of 3 brothers from the Gamilaroi mob near Pilliga who served in World War I. My dear mother, just a few lines to let you know that I am back again in France. I had an enjoyable 3-month spell in England. After my wound in the wrist, I am okay now. Mother, the 3 months I had in England, had 18 days leave and had a royal time on furlough. I received letters from you dated January 9 and none since then. My letters must be going astray. We have been having delightful weather over this side of the world, but today has been a bit cold. I went to a quaint old village church this AM. It reminded me of the last time I was in church with you, dear. Christmas morning, 1913, in Narrabri. Things have changed a lot since then. Writing paper is scarce here, so you will have to excuse one sheet. Well, Mother, I think I have told you all the news this time, trusting you are all well and happy. This leaves me in the pink of condition. Give my kind regards to Dad, May, and all my old friends in Pilliga. And do not worry about me, as I will look after myself. I remain your affectionate son, 1162 F.W. Firth. Bertie returned home in July 1919. Thank you for sharing with me those wonderful words from a veteran who served his country and has connections through to today's generation.
Many thanks, Uncle Harry. We will now hear from two of the Premier's Anzac Memorial Scholars, Andrew Phelps from Crestwood High School and Sienna Lucas from Carlingford High School, who will recite the poem In Flanders Fields, written in 1915 by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders field.
Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Thank you. I now ask the Cenotaph attendants and flag orderlies to take their position on the Cenotaph. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now conduct the wreath laying. At the conclusion of the formalities, other guests will have the opportunity to lay wreaths and show their respects. Cenotaph attendants will be on hand to assist. I now ask Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, Governor of New South Wales, to place the first wreath. The Honourable Gladys Berejiklian, Premier of New South Wales. Mr Ray James, Acting State President of the Returned and Services Leagues of Australia. Ms Diane Vott, representing the State President of the War Widows Guild Mrs. Nikki Hollis, President of Sydney Legacy. The Honourable Tom Bathurst, Chief Justice of New South Wales. The Honourable John Ajaka, President of the New South Wales Legislative Council. The Honourable Leslie Williams, representing the Speaker of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. Ms. Jodie McKay, Leader of the State Opposition. The Lord Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the wreath laying for the moment. Would you please now stand for the ode, which will be delivered by Mr. Ray James, Acting State President, the Returned and Services League of Australia, New South Wales branch. This will be followed by the sounding of the last post, played by able seaman Rachel Burns. The clock bells will toll 11 times, and we shall observe 1 minute's silence, following by the sounding of the reveille by the bugler.
They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.
Sentries, general salute. Present arms.
We'll now continue with the wreath laying. Representatives of Defence, Rear Admiral Jonathan Meade, Commander Australian Fleet, Royal Australian Navy, Brigadier Michael Garraway, representing the Australian Army, Air Commander Carl Newman, representing Royal Australian Air Force. Commissioners of Emergency Services. Deputy Commissioner Malcolm Lanyon, representing the New South Wales Police Force. Commissioner Carleen York, representing New South Wales State Emergency Service. Senior Assistant Commissioner Bruce McDonald, representing New South Wales Rural Fire Service. Deputy Commissioner Jim Hamilton, representing Fire and Rescue New South Wales. Assistant Deputy Commissioner Tony Gately, representing New South Wales Ambulance Service. Deputy Commissioner Alex Barrell, representing Marine Rescue New South Wales. Mr. Carl Hartleb, Dean of the Consular Corps. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The Remembrance Day Reflection this morning will now be offered by Rear Admiral Jonathan Meade, Commander Australian Fleet, Royal Australian Navy.
Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, ACQC, the Governor of New South Wales, the Honourable Gladys Berejiklian, the Premier of New South Wales, to our heroic veterans who have joined us today, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am humbled to be here with you as we commemorate and honour the courage, resilience and sacrifice of Australian military men and women who have served and continue to serve our great nation in conflict and in crisis. As we commemorate 102 years since the guns fell silent and cast our minds back over these years, we know too well the scars of war, and we long to prevent them from touching another Australian soul. In the early months of the First World War, great European armies manoeuvred and clashed on a colossal scale, while in Australia, a small volunteer force, the Australian Imperial Force, was preparing to join the conflict. Amongst those troops that were sent to fight was my grandfather, Dallas Meade, who fought and was gassed in the trenches of France, but he was lucky and survived. Not so lucky were the 62,000 that sacrificed their lives for our future. Almost 420,000 Australians enlisted for service during World War I, from a population of fewer than 5 million. Well over a third of our nation's young men went to war, and many of them did not return. Many suffered the physical marks of battle, yet more the deep emotional scars of memory. So today we reflect on the cessation of hostilities on the Western Front when the battlefields fell silent. We remember that 102 years on, it was not the war to end all wars. Less than 20 years after World War I ended, 39,000 Australian servicemen and women paid the ultimate sacrifice in the various combat theatres of World War II. During the Korean, Malayan, Borneo and Vietnam Wars, 77,000 Australians served with distinction. Sadly, 910 did not return home. So now we remember all those who served their nation, defending democratic freedoms or working to bring peace in troubled lands. Over the last 12 months, many storm clouds have gathered over our country. Drought, bushfires, floods, accidents, disasters and pandemic. Throughout, the spirit of our volunteers, firefighters, police, nurses, doctors, sailors, soldiers, aircrew men and women have lived on, and they have symbolised the spirit, the triumph of Australians over adversity. The strong and spirited character of our nation rests firmly on the inheritance from every one of the more than 103,000 Australians who have paid the ultimate price. It is our duty to ensure that their great sacrifice continues to be remembered and honoured. And as we pause here in solemn commemoration, all servicemen and women, past and present, should hold their heads high for their work in protecting and supporting their fellow citizens. For our tomorrows, they gave their today. We will remember them, lest we forget.
Thank you very much, Rear Admiral. We acknowledge over a century of service, both of our veterans and the efforts of the many ex-service organisations and support groups that provide valuable services to our veterans and their families. The Red Cross was formed in 1914 at the outbreak of the Great War, and we now hear from Patricia Skane, who will read excerpts of a letter from a young woman named Jean Kerlewis, a Red Cross volunteer nurse from 1919.
Thank you, Gareth. Mummy, if you really wanted to see me, you could come for a 3-hour picnic, if you like. But not the other two, not Daddy or my brother, for it seems much more risky for the men. How is influenza? I haven't seen a newspaper in 4 days, but the ambulances are coming in thick and fast. To be serious for a moment, supposing any of you get it badly, remember that it is the will to live that is the most important thing. Here the doctors and sisters say it is worth more than any drug that they use. There's a man here tonight, and a woman as well, who are keeping themselves alive by sheer willpower. And I think they're going to win after all. For God's sake, be careful, all 3 of you. I have to put it this seriously, because down here you don't really believe in influenza, or you think it's just the type that Daddy had recently. But it's not. And Daddy, you often go in and speak to the family before you've had a wash. I know you do, and more of you do the same thing too. But, oh, don't do it, because no amount of precaution is too much. Well, today is Sunday, and I'm down by the Parramatta River, lying luxuriously in the sun, out of the wind. I've got a box of chocolates with me, and my powder puff, and there's no need to wear my goggles and my gloves today, only my mask, and there's no need to wash until tea time. My idea of heaven is fast becoming a place where you don't have to wash every day, and you only have to clean your teeth 7 times a day, not 8. Please, send 13 picture books immediately. I'm far too sleepy to tell you about the children just now, but I really must have them sent. Oh, and a tin of biscuits would be handy. And 6 or 7 of those bandage masks that you are wearing, so that I can wear them under my big one, because it becomes loose at times. I know it's quite an absurd precaution, but a good many of the volunteer aides do it. We're all in very necessary and healthy states at the moment because doctor and matron do everything in their power to keep us that way. Oh, and I need a pair of rubber gloves and another set of goggles. I broke mine. I'm afraid you will see a rather long list of Walker deaths tomorrow, but don't worry. They were mainly new admissions that came in far too late. Now the hospital has practically emptied. We've only got 30 patients left, but it's just as hard to carry on with 30 patients as it is with 70. Well, more or less. But I have to go now, as we're about to have a rush in a day or two. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the service and care provided by nurses and carers for over 100 years now, and especially thank all frontline staff for their efforts across this year of 2020. Please now welcome Royal Australian Navy Chaplain Wyn Jones to the lectern for the prayer.
I invite you to pray with me. Lord God, help us this day to remember the sacrifice of those caught up in war and the generations of men, women and children who have died in the cause of liberty and peace. Help us to remember those who still bear the physical and mental scars and disabilities of their service. Help us to remember the widows, the partners and parents and orphans, and all those who waited in vain for the return of a loved one. Help us to remember the challenge, the courage, the camaraderie and compassion of war service. But save us from ever glorifying the horror and tragedy of war. We pray that we and all of Australia, gratefully remembering the courage of their sacrifice, may have the grace to live in a spirit of justice, of generosity, of unity, of peace. Living God, Father, Son and Spirit, help us to remember. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand while the Royal Australian Navy Band Sydney and musician Lee Robke sing the National Anthem. And reminder, due to current public health orders, we ask that you refrain from singing.
Sentries, general salute, present, arms.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
The Catafalque Party will now dismount the Cenotaph. Catafalque Party, dismount the Cenotaph.
Sentries, hold. Sentries, inwards, turn. Sentries by the centre, quick. Sentries, halt! Sentries, about, turn.
Ladies and gentlemen, Her Excellency the Governor will now receive the Vice-Regal Salute.
Sentries, general salute, present, arms. Sentries, ho!
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You may now be seated. We will open the ceremonial area shortly and invite anyone wishing to lay a wreath and pay their respects. We request that you do so with patience and respect for the occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the formalities for this morning's service. Thank you very much for your attendance. And a reminder, tonight at 7:45, the New South Wales Government will again be lighting the Sydney Opera House with red poppies to again recognise the service and sacrifice of our veterans. I thank you for your patience. We now welcome anyone wishing to lay a wreath and pay their respects in the ceremonial area.